Sure. All right. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Industrious, third episode of the year. We're very, very pleased to have James Chaukos join us on our interview. So I'm gonna hand it to Charles.
Thanks, Matt. James, so our first question is just could you give us a little overview of kind of your story from UCC until now?
Yeah, happy to. And thanks for having me on, guys. I graduated from UCC in 2005, came down here for college, went to Brown University, studied economics and history there, and then after graduating, went to JP Morgan. And so started my career in investment banking there. Actually worked beside another UCC alum, Joe Lace, who was a great teacher and is still a good friend. And was in banking for those 2.5 years and then switched a bunch of things at once, switched cities, industries, functions, and went to work at LinkedIn and the strategy team. And so I was in San Francisco doing that, initially in headquarters, and then eventually in Asia, working on Asia expansion. And then when I was in Asia, decided to go to business school. So came back to Philly, went to Wharton, went to biz school, and started in the middle of business school. So did that through business school, and then when I graduated, ended up spending the next 7 years building the company, holding a bunch of different roles. Initially co-founder, and then eventually chief financial officer, chief operating officer, and then did that through the acquisition in 2022.
Yeah, that sounds great. Before we dive deep into your entrepreneurial journey with cricket, just really curious about your role at LinkedIn, especially you mentioned Asia expansion. Could you tell us more about what were some of the strategic expansionary effort that you kind of spearheaded while you were at LinkedIn?
Yeah, so when I was at LinkedIn, I was initially in headquarters, and so we had a team that was a lot of former consultants, and we basically ran data-driven strategy projects for different functions of the company. And at the time, I wanted to try something different, and the two big strategic initiatives at LinkedIn were mobile and China. And so I basically started talking to those two groups, and it turned out that the Asia team was looking to grow their presence in the region, and they had a bunch of strategic questions they were trying to answer. And so I basically took that opportunity to move to Singapore and ended up covering everything from Japan to India to Australia, and got to travel a bunch for that job in countries and learn how all the local teams made decisions and tried to help them with some of those decisions. And ended up learning a lot. And uh, I'm I feel pretty lucky that I got that experience so early in my career. And yeah, it was thanks to the support of the folks running the Asia team, but also the folks running the strategy team and headquarters that they were flexible enough to kind of give me that opportunity.
Amazing. Um, Thanks, James. Could you just talk a little bit more about Cricket Health and what was the problem that you were working to solve there?
Yeah, so just by way of background, Cricket Health was one of the first value-based specialty care companies in the US. And so a lot of what had been done before then was disease management for all different types of diseases. And we were one of the first companies that said, we think there's a big enough business and enough impact to be had in this one specialty, which was chronic kidney disease. And so we basically started focusing on that part of healthcare. And the way that we were different and kind of the niche that we were able to carve out was what we were trying to do was manage these patients before they had kidney failure. And so for patients with kidney disease, their kidneys eventually fail and they need some form of renal replacement therapy, which is this life-sustaining therapy. And what we were trying to do was reach these patients before that point, help them manage their condition, help them slow the progression of the disease, and help them try to avoid dialysis altogether. And in the case where they did need some kind of renal replacement therapy, educate them on their options. So we were educating them about transplant, we're educating them about home dialysis and in-center hemodialysis for those that needed that therapy. And that hadn't really been done in such an intensive way. And so patients were really grateful to be getting this service and learning how they can, maintain as much function in their kidney as possible and keep their health as good as it could be for that period of time. And so that's basically what we ended up doing.
Yeah, James, just want to ask you to kind of elaborate on the whole patient experience. Um, let's say patient A enrolls into Cricket Health. What would kind of the day-to-day interaction look like between the patient and Cricket Health? Would it be kind of a weekly scheduled appointment? Can you just kind of walk us through the entire like patient interaction experience with Cricket Health once they enroll into the overarching program?
Yeah, totally. And I'll start with the status quo. So the way it worked before we started managing these patients was a lot of patients would basically go through what's called a crash into dialysis. So they basically show up at the ER. They would then find out that their kidneys had failed. They would have to get an emergency surgery, central venous catheter through their neck and start emergency dialysis. And for those patients, as you can imagine, that's not the ideal care pathway. It costs a ton of money when you're getting hospitalized and having these emergency surgeries. And it's obviously disruptive to their entire life. And so the way that we were different was we would partner with these health plans. We would get data from them and we would help them understand which of their patients were at high risk for eventually having kidney failure. And we would then reach out to these patients, work with their doctors, and first of all, help them understand what this disease was and help them understand that they would want to start managing this condition. And then for each patient, it was a little bit different. So, we had a tech-enabled service where we had a big clinical care team of nurses, pharmacists, dietitians, social workers that would interact with these patients, again, depending on the patient at different frequencies. So earlier stage patients tended to have less interaction with us than a patient that was stage 4 or 5 that was closer to needing some form of renal replacement therapy. And we basically paired them with this multidisciplinary care team. And so for some patients, they really cared about managing their diet. And so we connect them with a dietitian, get their questions answered. For other patients, they needed a medication reconciliation. They needed to better understand how their medications were working together. We would pair them with a pharmacist. And then on top of that, we also connected patients to each other. So we had a community of patients and a community of mentors that had been on all the different treatment options. And those mentors were able to explain what it's like to be on home dialysis or explain what it's like to get a, access placed. And so all of those anecdotes and all of those different patients were able to help these folks going through the transition.
And just to bounce off that, James, so you're to do this early stage detection, you're taking a lot of data from a lot of providers, and then you're flagging those that could have like traits that would, potentially have early stage kidney disease. Could you walk us through a little bit more of how that data actually led to get this like high accuracy detection, just like the nitty gritty?
Yeah, so data analytics was a huge part of what we did. And it started from the sales process with these health plans. And so when we would start working with a health plan, we would ingest their data, we'd help them understand the size of this population. And they really cared about that because they wanted to know the magnitude of the problem. They wanted to know how much these patients were costing them. And so we would help them with a lot of that analysis. And then from there, it continued. And so once we entered the implementation phase of the health plan, we would again be making sure that we were getting the right data. We were setting up the pipes to ingest that data. And then we had a whole team that was ingesting, cleaning, maintaining, and analyzing the data. And so it was a huge part of what we did. And as you guys may know, there's a lot of different data sources within healthcare. The big ones that we were using were claims and then labs. And a big part of what we did was, figure out which was right, reconcile those two sources of data, and then build these predictive analytics that would tell us, based on all of this clinical data, what do we think is the chance that this person is going to eventually have kidney failure? And so we would use that to basically figure out who are the right folks to reach out to and which folks need the most attention right now.
Yeah, James, could you tell us more about like that whole data collection infrastructure you set up? Um, just like I think a lot of companies right now, in order to build like really efficient like machine learning model, they need to build like that infrastructure or that pipeline. So can you just like give us some insights on like how to build a successful infrastructure pipeline so you have like a very high accuracy prediction model?
Yeah, I mean, this was a multi-year process for us. It definitely didn't happen overnight. And I feel lucky that we had some really good data leaders that we were able to hire at Cricut that led this from the beginning. I mean, when we were, I think, 10 or 12 people, we hired a guy that had a lot of experience, this guy, James Massoud, who he had worked in healthcare a long time. He understood healthcare data, and he just had that domain expertise. And that's basically where we started. And um, yeah, I guess the thing that most people don't realize is that it's not glamorous and it's not easy to do all that data analytics work. I mean, a lot of it is really cleaning up the data and and standardizing all the fields that you have. And uh, you know, I think that managing that team and keeping them motivated is candidly, it's a tough job, and it's one that you just kind of have to keep working hard at, because um, as you grow, you obviously want to increase the amount of data you're ingesting, and the complexity just continues to increase. So yeah, I felt lucky that we had really good data engineers and data scientists that we were able to hire at Cricut. And again, many of them are still there today and still doing that job.
Yeah, that's awesome. So James, kind of transitioning into more of the interpersonal side of things. So you and your co-founder Arvin, you guys go all the way back to LinkedIn, and you mentioned in the podcast that it was over the summer, like you guys met for coffee, and then this idea of Cricut kind of just born out of this conversation. So can you tell us more about like this almost like serendipity like interaction with Arvin? Like what kind of like characteristics about you and Arvin like back in LinkedIn made you want to like dive into this venture with him? Because you mentioned in the podcast that it was it was a pleasure working with Arvin.
Yeah, yeah, I will say I've seen this decision about co-founders go really well, as was the case with us, but I've also seen it go badly. And so you'll hear that from any founder, that that's a really important decision. And um, yeah, it definitely kind of makes or breaks the trajectory of a lot of companies. For me, the decision to work with Arvin was pretty simple. I mean, I knew I wanted to go to an earlier stage company and get experience at that really early stage. And I knew that Arvin and I worked well together. I knew we trusted each other. We communicated well with each other. And so working with him again was a no-brainer. And I basically joined in the summer between the 2 years of business school. And so that was also a little bit lucky, because I could kind of dip my toes in the early stage, see if I liked it, and then, do that before deciding to join full time. And then to the second part of your question, in terms of the qualities that, you know, I admire in Arvind and that made us good partners, the two big ones would be integrity and patience. So on the integrity side, there's a lot of examples in healthcare of companies that um, don't do right by patients. And I felt like with Arvind, he was really good at holding the line and making sure we stay true to our values. And so integrity, I think, is a big one. And then patience would be the second one. Uh, I'm not the most patient person, candidly, and so he was definitely more patient than me, and he kind of rubbed off on me in that way. And you need a balance, right? You need a balance between patience and urgency in a startup. And uh, he definitely was able to kind of bring that patience and that measure to what we were doing. So those are the two ones that come to mind.
Yeah, that's awesome. Want to kind of also transition into kind of what recently happened, you know, a 2.4 billion three-way merger between Interwell, Fresenius Health, and Cricket Health. Just wanted to ask about first question, what do you think each of the three players bring to this M&A? What kind of individual value do they add to this whole ecosystem of, you know, delivering the best kidney care for their patient?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, we sold the company in 2022 in a three-way merger. The merger was between Cricket Health, Fresenius Health Partners, which is basically the value-based care contracting division of Fresenius, which is a big public company, and Interwell Health, which is a national nephrologist network. And so the logic for the deal was we were basically bringing together all the pieces that you would need to be a leader in this space. So Cricket brought the care model, the data analytics and technology. Fresenius was bringing their experience in value-based care contracting and those contracts with health plans. And Interwell was bringing the nephrologists across the country. And in that way, you were bringing together all those different pieces that you need to, you know, operate at scale in healthcare. And that was basically the logic for doing that deal.
Got it. Now, like, so the merger happened in 2022. So now, like, kind of looking at it, like, you know, 2 years down the road, like, what are your thoughts on like kind of the synergy and like how well these three players are kind of merging and meshing together?
Yeah, it's gone well. I mean, obviously, each of the organizations had its own unique culture, and we had to be very intentional about bringing the teams together and making sure that there was a culture values that everyone could get behind. And the merger process itself took a while. So from us announcing the deal to getting the approvals and closing the deal, and then even after that, continuing the integration, it's a multi-year process. Um, but thankfully, you know, everyone was excited to do this deal, and everyone was excited about the prospect of bringing together all of these complementary pieces. And so there was enough excitement about the transaction and enough excitement about bringing together these different teams that we were able to kind of see it through and spend that time over those years doing that.
Yeah, just really curious about your personal emotion, like seeing kind of your brainchild for, you know, 7 years plus, kind of involved in this like three-way merger and like part of like this big ecosystem, as you said. Like, can you just walk us through like your emotions? I can imagine it must be quite rich.
Yeah. So to be honest, I was really happy. I mean, starting a company was harder than I expected going in. And everybody says you need to be prepared for, you know, 7 to 10 years of doing this venture. And even when you're told that, it's still a lot of work, and it's hard. And so for me, I was excited that we were taking the company to this point and finding that solid landing place for everyone, right? For our investors, for our employees, most importantly for our patients, and our customers. And so in all those ways, I was happy to see the transaction through and be there and make sure that um, you know, all of those folks found that landing spot. And not every company can say that, right? I mean, unfortunately, there are a ton of examples in healthcare of companies that go left and don't make it to that point. So to be honest, the emotions were all good, and we're happy ones.
Love to hear it. So that that's a that's we kind of heard the start of cricket and the end. I want to like personally, I want to really understand, you know, the middle. Like, what are like the nitty gritty details that an entrepreneur that like kind of not glamorizes the process? Obviously, you know it's hard, and you've highlighted that. But what are like those relevant pieces of information that, you know, wouldn't be brought up in most conversations?
Yeah, so I think the things that aren't spoken about are it's something I mentioned, right? It's how hard the process of starting a company is. A lot of the press focuses on, you know, the extreme successes like think Amazon, Google, And then the other side of it is the abject failures, right? Like Theranos and alike. But for me, starting a company, and Cricket thankfully was largely a success, but it definitely took a personal toll. I mean, I gained a bunch of weight during COVID, and I think by the end of it, I was overdue for some time with my kids and time with my wife, and so there's definitely a personal toll there. And so, if I ever do it again, I think I'm going to be more intentional about making sure that there's some balance there, and that taking time for all of those personal things. And again, all things considered, I was lucky to have co-founders that did prioritize family and made that a priority. But I would say that's the part of a startup that people don't really talk about a lot, is the fact that it's really easy just to immerse yourself in it, and frankly, it's part of the job too, is making sure that you do whatever it takes to make sure the company's successful, and to make sure that for your patients, for your employees, that everything kind of goes right. But that's what I'd probably highlight there, Jack.
Thank you for that. And I guess the next question is kind of just, what are some of the skills and aspects that you learned at JP Morgan and LinkedIn that you were able to implement as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, so JP Morgan, I know investment banking isn't the most attractive industry these days, but for me, I mean, I had a great experience. As I mentioned, I sat beside Joe, who's another UCC alum, and our team was full of teachers. I mean, it was a bunch of people that took time to teach you what you needed to know, and I really had no idea what I was doing initially. I mean, I studied economics, but it had very little to do with finance and actually doing deals. And so I learned everything on the job, and so I felt really lucky to be on that team. At JP Morgan, there's a few things, right? So like there's the actual content of the job. So I did learn about capital raising, both equity and debt, and M&A, and that's what I would say was the actual like domain knowledge that I learned. In terms of the skills, the things I learned there were, the importance of hard work, attention to detail, and those types of skills that you kind of need in business. And then at LinkedIn, it was a bit different. I mean, at LinkedIn, again, the domain expertise I got was the importance of data and how important that is in building a company. And then the intangible things I learned at LinkedIn were the importance of culture and people. It was a huge part of LinkedIn, was the culture we had at the company, the fact that the company had its North Star that it wouldn't stray from, which was, being members first. And those are the things I learned at LinkedIn were more around people and culture. And so, yeah, with Cricket, I mean, I drew from both, right? In terms of JP Morgan, obviously part of the Cricket journey was raising capital from venture investors and eventually private equity. And eventually we did an M&A transaction. So the experience there was helpful. And then from the LinkedIn experience, I think that a lot of the training I had there on the importance of data and using data to make strategic decisions, I eventually applied at Cricket, where we tried to be as data driven as possible whenever we made a decision. And at the same time, prioritize the people side of it. So we, from a very early days, made sure we set our culture at Cricket. We got the whole company together when we were probably 12 or 13 people, and tried to actually codify our culture values. And I think a lot of that came from the LinkedIn background that Arvin and I had.
Yeah, James, it has been phenomenal to kind of pick your brain and like learn about your journey. But I think, us in the audience want to know like what's kind of the 5-year plan for James after this. Like, because you mentioned that, it was really, really rewarding to build Cricket and like kind of get everyone like sorted, and like now we know that you're like an advisor for, a couple like high growth startup and companies. Like, what is the plan for James for the next 5 years?
Yeah, so since we did the transaction in 2022, I've mainly been taking time off. So as you mentioned, I've been advising some early and growth stage companies, but primarily spending time with the kids, and did a little bit of traveling and just took time off last year. So that was all nice. I think I'm ready to do something again. So starting to figure out exactly what that is. And I think there's a high likelihood I stay in healthcare, honestly, just because there's a lot of parts of the system that are still very broken. And I think the impact of what you do in healthcare, it's really palpable, because at least in the case of cricket, right, these patients, they'd been neglected for so long that they were just really, really appreciative of what we were able to build. And so I think there's a high likelihood I stay in healthcare, but yeah, we'll see.